I'm just following the steps of John and Eric when they say. So our passage today is Matthew 9, 18 through 26, and this is what it says. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come, lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, If I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned and seeing her said, Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. We can't get really far into this passage before we're kind of forced to look at what happened before it. He says, while he was saying these things to them, so in the midst of whatever is happening, but saying what to who. My intent isn't to review what has already been spoken by John and Eric, but rather to kind of see them as building blocks in a progression of what Matthew is trying to lead us to. So from Eric, we heard about the healing of the paralytic man and the forgiveness of his sins. That was in Matthew 9, 1 through 8. And then from John, we heard the calling of Matthew, the tax collector, in Matthew 9, 9 through 17. I spent probably more time than I should struggling with comparing the contrast between Matthew and Mark because they do have the same story, but what they share and how they share it is very different, and how they line up with today's message. And that was I probably spent too much time doing that, but I think the fruits of that paid off later on as I was going through and was able to sort of put things in order. Mark offers a level of detail to this event, while Matthew seeks to give a concise retelling of events. And I think as we progress through this, you'll see why he is as concise as he is, choosing in some cases to remove said detail and put in others. In my research, I actually found that Matthew was written after Mark, and then in some cases, Matthew actually relied heavily on Mark's text to write his own gospel. But I think the reason for that is the purpose of those books, while they're the Gospels, Matthew's is more concise, but I believe, and we'll see this further, that he is clearly making a case for the supremacy of Christ in our lives. And so while these stories are very like, boop, 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 the point is to point to the supremacy of Christ, not everything else. And so what he leaves in is important. And so that they were written at different times. And also the other thing that I was able to sort of parse out as I was reading through Matthew and Mark is that there does appear to be a pretty significant gap in the timeline between what happens in verses 1 through 19 and in the story we're going to happen today. So while Matthew lines them up directly after each other, there is a gap, but I think the intention he lines them up is, again, to make these building blocks for the supremacy of Christ in our lives. In Matthew 9, 18 through 19, it says, While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come, lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Recently, I've been listening to a podcast by the Bible Project, and they had a whole series on how to read the Bible. And one of the things they encouraged the listeners to do was to not only look at what is being spoken, but look at what is not being said. Because often what is left out is just as important as what is put in. So while I think to view this story in its fullest context, it requires reading and studying both Mark and Luke, I believe what Matthew put in is intentional, it's specific, both in what he chose to include and both in what he chose to exclude from this story. There are a couple things we can gain an understanding from the other Gospels regarding this particular ruler. He is a ruler of the synagogue, so a religious elite of the time, and possibly due to other interactions. He had seen Jesus before, understood who Jesus was to an extent, but never had really had a ton of personal interaction with him. We also find out that his name is Jairus. I think that's how it's pronounced. I checked it yesterday, but Jairus. If I say it wrong, I apologize. Right, so Jairus has had interactions with Jesus in the past, and while Matthew reports in his book that Jairus' daughter has already died, both in Mark and in Luke, Jairus is quoted as saying, "My daughter is dying." I suspect that in the midst of this story, Jairus actually left his house before his daughter died, and that due to his desperation, he went to the one person that he'd heard of that might be able to make a difference in his life, and that's Jesus. It's also worth noting that while this interaction is happening, while Jairus has left his house and is en route to Jesus, this is long before Lazarus has been raised from the dead. And so there really is no precedence for what is about to happen. It has never been seen before. It is something new. And in his desperation, he sought the only man that he thought could help, which was Jesus. What I find incredible is that in all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of them come into alignment in this, is that after Jesus heard these things, Jesus went. He went. He didn't get angry at the interruption or upset that his plans had suddenly been changed. He went. I think it's a simple truth, and maybe in the grand scheme of this narrative, it can be overlooked or missed. But as followers of Jesus that are trying to model his example, what is our posture when we face interruption in life? And for me in particular, I found this very convicting because I'm somebody that's very like A and B based. Like, let's go from A to B. We don't need to stop at C. Actually, me and Mike had a text going on about a trip we took a couple of years ago, where we did a hiking trip. And my thing was like, oh, we hiked, we got to the point, great, let's turn back. Well, everyone wanted to hang out. They wanted to see the view. That's just not me. So, like, in particular, great, we saw the view, cool, we're done. It was also freezing cold, and I was tired of being cold. But, like, Jesus went. He didn't get upset about the interruption, and I think that's a simple truth that we need to carry as we walk through life, that there are going to be things that happen that are inconvenient, that may not seem like part of the plan, but we are still called to be servants of the Lord and followers of his way. And to me, it's the posture of how we approach those situations. It's not an interruption, because it may very well be part of the plan. It may just not be part of your plan. It might be part of his plan, though, right? Yet in the midst of all this, so now we have Jesus was in the middle of whatever he was doing. He then gets interrupted by Jairus and says, hey, you need to come. My daughter is dying. You need help. In the midst of all this, somewhere along the way, en route to Jairus' house, we don't know the time frame for when Jairus met up with Jesus to being en route to the house. We come to Matthew 9, 20 through 21. It says, behold, a woman who had suffered from discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I touch his garment, I will be made well. Mark and Luke report that she had spent all her money on doctors and physicians, and still she was able to be helped, and in other cases they reported that she was even worse. And for all intents and purposes, she was at the end of her rope. Does that ring true for anyone else in here? Just anyone? And somehow over the span of our lives, things have just continued to get harder. Maybe it's just been a bad week. Maybe it's been a bad month. Maybe it's been a bad year. Or maybe like this woman, it's been well over a decade with no resolution. And in fact, things are getting worse. And so here she is, now physically pained, emotionally drained, financially strained. Anyone else feel that? Like, to me, I'm like, yeah, like I can relate to somewhere in this story about one of those things. Does that anybody resonate there with that? And yet, through all that, even though she is all these things, she has the faith to reach out and touch his garment. It's important to know that due to her conditions, she was considered unclean, which meant that she shouldn't even been where she was in the first place. Unclean meant you needed to be away, isolate yourself. And because she was unclean, she was also unfit to enter the temple, which would really be the one place where she could essentially be made clean or healed. And so perhaps she viewed this as her only chance that she had left. After years of paying for doctors and other things, this was the only chance she had. A chance encounter between other things, in the midst of whatever. An interruption to Jesus' thought-out plan. That was her only chance, was to find him. And Jesus' response is poignant but simple. Matthew 9, 20, 22. It says, Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, for your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. It's very simple, very straightforward, but very powerful. In that moment, she went from an unidentified woman to a daughter of the king, redeemed, made well, and cleansed. Only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus can make the unclean clean, the unwell well, the orphans children of the king. What I find interesting, and maybe this kind of goes without saying, but is that he didn't say, "It's because you touched my garment that you were healed." No, he said, "It is your faith. It is your faith that has made you well." I think this interaction encapsulates the faith that we talk about so much here at Church Without Borders. It's impossible to separate what we believe from how we act. And if we are trying to do that, the only person we're fooling is ourselves. We can't believe one thing and act another. That's just hypocrisy. And James says it this way, "I will show you my faith by my works," because for him the two were inseparable. Faith is the outpouring of work. You can't separate the two. They're together. And it's this act of faith in the midst of trial that we are witnessing, that Jesus says, "You have been made well. Because of your faith, you are well." It is this same faith that was credited to Abraham as his righteousness. Again, it wasn't because of what he did. It was because of his faith that now he has righteousness. The same righteousness is now being bestowed upon this woman. There's also meaning to be found in the garment that she touched. Again, Matthew is very poignant. He has these very small details, but all of them have so much rich meaning behind them that you can get really lost in the details. And I did for a little bit, and then I came back. In Numbers, God charges people to wear a tassel on the corner of their robe. And this tassel was to remind them of his commandments. I didn't get it to put on the slide, but Numbers 15:39 reads, "This will serve as tassels for you to look at, so that you may remember all the Lord's commandments and obey them, and not prostitute yourselves by following your own hearts and your own eyes." If there is ever a definition that I think fitting of what faith is not, I think it's Numbers 15. Following our own hearts and our own eyes. Because what is faith? That's faith, right? It's looking at what's in front of us and acknowledging that there's something more happening. It's acknowledging that there's something beyond us that we can't see or feel that's greater than our emotions, that is there and ready. It's believing that sometimes in spite of whatever is in front of us, that there is something greater going on. And that beyond what we can see, God is continuing to work and will work through the circumstances. Maybe it's not what's right in front of us now, and maybe we're seeing the exact opposite, but it doesn't mean that he isn't working. And in the same way, for that woman who was healed, her external actions are a sign of an internal belief. And in her actions, she touches the very thing that's supposed to remind her not to trust in her own heart and in her own eyes. Crazy, right? Like this is literally an interaction this is a side interaction to another interaction that interrupted Jesus' life. And yet it's all piling up to just intent. Jesus' intent. I don't think that Jairus interrupting Jesus was viewed as an interruption. I don't think that this woman passing by Jesus was an accident. It was all to point to Jesus and his supremacy, not only over the sick, but over the unclean, and soon to see over death itself. And it's the same faith that we are supposed to have, to act outside of ourselves in spite of what we see, and not trust in our own eyes, in our own hearts, but trust in what Jesus is doing. She's healed, she's made well, she's clean. And in the midst of all this, someone from Jairus' house catches up to the crowd and delivers the news that Jairus' daughter is dead. I just want to pause right there for a sec. Can you imagine being Jairus? I mean, imagine being in his footsteps. We don't have an exact time frame, but he left his house in desperation, seeking the one man, more than a man, that he felt could restore his daughter's health. And now it's too late. He had heard of Jesus, healer of the sick and blind, and he even just witnessed Jesus heal a woman. And yet, now for him, maybe it's too late, or he feels it's too late because she's not sick anymore. And maybe he hoped that if he just got to Jesus fast enough, if he just, from his own will, of his own volition, of his own speed, just got there fast enough, he would be able to heal his sick and dying daughter, not his dead daughter. After all, Jesus had never raised anyone from the dead. Yet. And maybe this is you right now. Your hopes got dashed, and now you feel that Jesus is too late. You've heard and maybe even witnessed him come through for others, but for you, he seems out of reach or just too late. It's at this point that all the Gospels do come into alignment again. Mark and Luke do add a level of narrative that Matthew doesn't have, but I think, again, what he includes is poignant and important. At this point, they all come in alignment with Matthew 9:23 and 24. So when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. In the CSB translation of this verse, it says, "as a crowd lamenting loudly." And in Luke, it says, "everyone was crying and mourning for her." That sounds awfully a lot like a funeral to me. And so while we don't know how much time has passed between when Jairus left his house seeking Jesus to heal his dying daughter to when he found Jesus and Jesus' arrival at his house, but prior to the news of his daughter dying, it's been enough time that others have gathered and are lamenting her death. Just picturing that time frame for us. You know, Jairus went out from his house in hope of what could be. And yet, now he's on the road. He's witnessed Jesus' healing power. His hope's even higher. And then news comes that his daughter has died. The hopes are dashed. And now he's in this in-between, this unknown. I feel like somewhere in there's this reference for Lord of the Rings about Jesus not coming too late or too early, but coming precisely when he means to, you know? Jesus' timing is never wrong. It may feel late to you. It may feel earlier to you, but he is deeply intentional about what he does and when he does it and how. Matthew's account is the shortest of the three in the Gospels, but I think it's because of this. He wants us to understand the weight of what about is to take place. He wants to establish Jesus as having authority over life itself. Over the past couple of passages, we've seen Jesus' authority over sin. We've seen Jesus' authority over the sick. And in these last two interactions, we see Jesus' authority over the clean and unclean, and we're about to see Jesus' authority over life itself. Matthew 9:25-26. When the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all the district. Jesus brought her back to life. I think this is why Matthew, when he recounts this story, he speaks to Jairus at the beginning saying that his daughter had died, because Matthew didn't want to leave it to question whether she was dead or not. Because if she was dying, maybe he just healed her while maybe she was just sick and he healed her. He didn't want to leave a doubt of Jesus being someone that can bring people back from the dead. And this is why he is this progression. He is establishing a Jesus that is worthy of our faith, because of he never, in every interaction he went. He didn't get angry at the interruption. He is there for us in the midst of every moment. He can be found faithful even when we are unfaithful. And since really the beginning of chapter 9, we see Jesus proclaim his authority to forgive sins and heal the sick. And now with this last interaction, Jesus has proclaimed his authority over life itself. But what I find interesting in some cases is that he didn't do it to everybody. He didn't proclaim it widely. It was other people that did that. He did it privately and in the intimacy of a home with only his closest disciples and the mom, or Jairus and his wife and the daughter. And isn't that how he works in our lives? Like, he always works in the quiet moments, in the in-betweens, in the interruptions. He's working, making his will made known for your life and around you, even when you can't see it. And he's saying, find me faithful, because I am faithful. I'm worthy of that. And just as the Father's faith in Jesus to bring his daughter back to life is the same faith that brings life brings faith out, brought us out of life to death, or from death to life. That faith that he has is the same faith that we have that has forgiven our sins. And so maybe today you're like that woman in the street at the end of your rope, reaching out beyond yourself, and in your faith you find healing for what's next, whatever that looks like. It's different for everyone. Whatever that looks like, you have found it. Maybe today you're like the father before he enters the house, caught in immense grief and hopelessness. The hopes you had for the future of your daughter are dashed, or whoever, and you're caught between immense grief, and you're waiting for an answer, and that can be really uncomfortable. That can be difficult. My family, I'm going to just share a little personal story. My family's been dealing with this. That's not a great word. But I had an uncle that went into the hospital on November 25th, and we found out he passed away this past week. And so we've had to really dig deep into ourselves and find the faith to be like, this is good. Like, we don't see it as good because he's gone. But like, if Jairus' daughter had died, is God good? If Jairus' daughter is raised to life like we know she was, is God good? And he's good in both, because God works on an eternal or a infinite timeline where the worst that the world can offer us, the worst thing the world can do is enter us into eternity. It's nothing on the blip of radar in God's world. And so we have to dig deep into that hope. Even when hope seems lost, it is still there. It is still right. And usually it's right around the corner, because Jairus is about to witness the biggest miracle that had ever happened up in that time, the raising of his daughter. And yet it can seem overwhelming when that grief and there's no resolution. But Jesus is faithful even in the midst of that. Worship team can come up. We're going to close. And maybe like the daughter, this is kind of just the final thoughts. Maybe like the daughter, you're not physically dead, but you're dead in your own sin, still lost and without a cure. And I just want to remind you that Jesus is worthy of our faithfulness because of his supremacy over life itself. And just like the woman in the street, Jesus is willing to meet you exactly where you are, to forgive you of your sins, to cleanse you of whatever is wrong, and to bring you back into right standing with him. And sometimes that looks like being brought to life, and sometimes it looks like being welcomed into the gates of eternity as a faithful servant. So I ask that you find Jesus to be faithful because he is worthy of your faith, and he is worthy of the supremacy of life itself.